The Cherry Rage, a riot in Graz. The name Kirchenrummel, meaning cherry rage, may sound harmless, but it actually refers to a brutal and tragic event that took place in Graz 2 years after the end of the First World War. Although peace had formally prevailed since 1918, the effects of the war were still being clearly felt in many European regions and cities. Political, economic and social upheavals erupted into a number of conflicts, as was also the case in the newly founded Republic of Austria. The food supply was generally poor, while unemployment and inflation were both running high. In Graz too, many people, often impoverished, suffered from housing and food shortages and saw profiteering and price gouging in particular as the fundamental problem of their time. Following the First World War, women were now playing a greater role in politics. Having maintained the home front during wartime from 1919 onwards, they were able to exercise their right to vote. They also increasingly banded together in associations and demonstrated for their cause. As pent-up social conflicts from the early post-war period were unleashed, the situation in Graz escalated on the 7th of June 1920. It began with a protest by mostly middle-class and lower-middle-class women at Kaiser-Joseph-Platz, a farmers' market in the centre of Graz. They called for a reduction in food prices and a stop to profiteering. At the heart of the protest were the higher prices being charged for cherries. The demonstration steadily gained momentum and intensified as market stalls were smashed before the unrest spread into the city centre and turned into a general anti-government protest. Violence broke out and there was looting, especially of Jewish shops, which were blamed for the price gouging in an anti-Semitic interpretation. The executive forces present were not able to contain the situation. As evening came, they fired into the crowd, killing 13 people and injuring dozens. The Graz Cherry Rage riot was not an isolated, unique event, but a symptom of its time. Similar hunger and bread riots broke out in many places, including not far from Graz in Leoben and Vienna and in many European cities, for example, in Germany and Italy. On the 7th of June 1920, it was a Monday, I went to the market on Kaiser Franz Joseph Platz. This time, not to shop at the market stalls, but to demonstrate. By then, we could hardly afford to buy any food because everything was getting dearer and dearer all the time. There was profit-mongering and illegal trade everywhere, which was pushing up the prices. Even though the war was over, the food shortages kept getting worse, especially in the cities. I read in the newspaper that in Vienna, 91,000 children had already been sent abroad for a recuperation. For 2,000, the situation was so bad that they were close to being at the cemetery gates. There were aid programs like that for Styria too. However, finding food was a challenge every day. Although, thank God, my husband had come home safe and sound from the war, the situation was getting desperate. I didn't know how I was going to keep my children going anymore. One way of dealing with it was to demonstrate loudly for price cuts and finally put a stop to the profiteering. Even though the harvest was good, the market stalls were making the food more and more expensive. Recently, cherries were twice the usual price even. There were many of us there that Monday, mostly women, come to voice our grievances and distress. I saw market stalls being knocked over and more people, including many young people and men, joined the protest. In the evening, I heard gunshots in the city. I found out from the evening papers that the protest had got out of control. Many of the Jewish shops had been looted, they said, and the day ended in a bloodbath. There were several dead, apparently. The newspaper must have been right. When I got to the market on Tuesday, Everything was empty and desolate, and some women formed a procession to the food office. My hope is that the newly founded Commission for Price Regulation of the Graz markets will prove its worth. The Commission includes market traders and growers, but also housewives' organizations from all of the parties. Let's hope that it bears fruit, and we get some fruit we can afford. This woman is not based on a real person. She is representative of the involvement of the women of Graz in the cherry rage.
Rumors of a demonstration getting out of hand on Kaiser Joseph Platz had already reached us when we were called together at the station house on Monday, the 7th of June, 1920. Apparently, some women were going on rampage through the farmers' market because they were upset about the high prices. We went over there, aiming to calm the crowd down and bring the situation under control, an easy job that we'd performed satisfactorily in a similar way many times before. But this time, we had to back down. The situation escalated, although the protest had even resulted in the prices being lowered. Suddenly, the crowd had grown to several hundred people, the protesting housewives having been joined by youths, men, and even children. Their anger was directed against the market vendors who did not want to reduce their prices. Against these masses, there were too few of us, and we were utterly powerless. Rage against the government, the food office, the profiteers, and the price gougers, often with the Jewish traders as the targets of popular resentment, came out in more than just the chanting of the crowd. I later heard from colleagues that 2 of our people had been spat on, beaten, and kicked at Jakominiplatz. There were reports in the newspaper later on. In the city center, the crowd kept dragging people from the trams, so in the late afternoon, traffic was stopped completely. I saw a lot of smashed shop windows, and stones kept flying out of the crowd. We had to stand by and do nothing. It was only with the support of constabulary forces and units from the People's Defense that we had any hope of restoring order. By then, however, the riots had already moved on to the other side of the River Mur. As I heard, there were attacks on Jews, and many of the Jewish shops were looted. Jewish merchants generally had a reputation among many people for being guilty of profiteering. We had to defend ourselves with our sabers drawn. Later on, the constabulary and the People's Defense were able to herd the rioting crowd on Südtiroler Platz, the Murvorplatz. Then shots were fired. The security guard is not based on a real person. He is representative of the involvement of security guards in the Cherry Rage riot.
The local press soon dubbed the unrest the Cherry Rage and continued to fuel the conflict. As was common in the period after the First World War, almost all of the newspapers were close to political movements, and their news reporting was aligned with their political views. In addition, there were newspapers that were published by political parties, which were known as party papers. Their main focus was on how the situation could have escalated in this way. The question of who was responsible for the bloodbath and the dead and injured was also discussed in the press. There was a mention of a horde of jeering rascals and women. Elsewhere, there was a report of women who were particularly notable for their wild ranting. In other places, there were accounts of young boys, students, and former officers on the rampage. The Grazer Tagblatt, a radical national newspaper, saw the government and the Jewish population as being to blame. Now, however, honest working people see and feel that inflation is growing and oppressing the tattered lives of the majority of the population, while the golden age has come for profiteering and for Jewish business morals. This had to provoke bitterness in wider circles and created the kind of mood that is bound to explode. The Arbeiterwille, on the other hand, was the newspaper of the Social Democrats. Concerning the cherry rage, we read, "The terrible uproar about the bloody events of Monday still resonated yesterday among the population of Graz. On serious faces everywhere, one read the question, did it have to go so far? Was the occasion that led to the violence in anything like reasonable proportion to the sacrifices required? One thing is certain. 13 people lost their lives, 12 men and 1 woman. According to the investigation protocol, a total of 40 people were arrested in the vicinity of the shooting at Murvorplatz, today's Südtiroler Platz. Of these 40 people, most were workers between the ages of 16 and 24.
The artist Axel Leskoschek was witness to the Cherry Rage riot, an event that greatly influenced his perspective as a political activist. Born in Graz in November 1889, Leskoschek held social democratic and later communist convictions that can be traced back to his experiences in the early 20th century. On the one hand, his military service in the First World War, when he almost died from a head injury. And on the other hand, his unbroken resistance to National Socialism, which forced him into exile, first in Switzerland and then in Brazil. As an artist, Leskoschek often chose to use the technique of woodcut, which meant that his work could easily be reproduced and, combined with his preferred style of realism, gave it the mass appeal he sought. During the 20th century, the woodcut particularly established itself as a medium of resistance and protest. Clear contours and strong contrasts underline the expressive, haunting imagery. The Cherry Rage riot took place against a backdrop of hardship, hunger, and change. It provides an insight into a deeply divided society in Europe, while showing the extreme views that went along with it. This is why Leskoschek explored the Cherry Rage as a subject for his Cycle on Contemporary History in the 1950s. At that time, Leskoschek once again found himself confronted with political rifts in the context of the Cold War. Rejected as an artist in Austria due to his political views, he personally experienced mistrust and the exclusion of political dissidents. Axel Leskoschek's life and work were punctuated by external and internal conflict. This was reflected in the constant confrontation between his own attitude and the political events of the 20th century. As a result, he had to endure imprisonment, escape, life in exile with his Jewish wife Marussia, and his work being disregarded. It was not until 1968, just 8 years before his death, that the artist and professor, already highly esteemed in Brazil, finally received recognition in Austria and the first public honors for his life's work.